So let's talk now about some other methods of practicing playing in tune in your music, let's say. So now you are anticipating the pitch, the physical placement, and the resonance. How are you going to train your hand to be in tune? The first thing I want to talk about is tuners versus drones. I get asked about this a lot, specifically, is using a tuner a good thing to do to play in tune? And my answer is no. Not to disappoint you, but my answer is no. The reason for that is when you use a tuner to tell you if you're in tune, you're training your eyes, you're not training your ears, and you're not going to have a tuner on stage to tell you whether you're in tune or not. There's also a lot of research that shows that when you get simultaneous feedback, so that's what happens when you watch a tuner, right? Right in the moment, it tells you, are you flat or sharp? When you get simultaneous feedback, it really diminishes your ability to create an internal representation of what something should sound like in this case, and also feel like. Your eyes just override your brain's ability to really create a deep, rich, strong internal sense of what does this note sound and feel like when I'm in tune. There are apps now that will allow you to record yourself playing, and it will tell you whether you were sharp or flat, and it will give you kind of like a graph. The best way to use those apps is to play and record and create a sense while you're playing of how in tune you think you are, and then look at it after the fact. Don't watch it in real time. It's much better to create a strong internal sense like we were talking about, to do something, hear how it sounds, feel what it feels like in the moment, have a sense of, okay, I think I played that really well in tune, and then you get the feedback after the fact so you can compare what you thought you did to what you actually did. When you get feedback in the moment, you don't create that sense of what you thought you did, and then it's very difficult to adjust. I am a fan of practicing with drones because that is training your ear, right? It's true that you're not going to have a drone on stage, and so ultimately the drone needs to go inside your head. But practicing with a drone is a better step, I think, than practicing with a tuner, because you have to learn how to tune your notes to the tuner, and then you're using your ear. The downside of drones is that you can't hear resonance. And so I use drones somewhat sparingly, usually only for keys that are really, really bad, that don't have a lot of resonance to begin with, to help me be grounded in the pitch. I also use them to put in like whole entire chords so that I can hear the context in which my notes have to exist. So if you're not going to be practicing with a tuner, how should you practice intonation? So one thing that I think is really helpful is to stop on the note in question. You know, okay, something is wrong with this note here in this passage. I know it's out of tune. I need to do something about it. So you want to stop on that note, and if it's out of tune, don't adjust it. I know it's going to make you cringe, but you need to make sure you know, is it flat or is it sharp? Because if you don't know how to adjust it. So let's take an example. I'm going to do the opening of, I'll do the opening of the 6th Bach cello suite. And the last note I'm going to play out of tune on purpose. All right. Okay, that was supposed to be a G. I played an F sharp on purpose, but maybe I'm practicing and I've noticed, oh man, that G is always really, really out of tune. So the way I'm going to practice it is I'm going to isolate it. So the 2 notes right before are a G and a G, and then the G that I just played out of tune on purpose. So the first thing I'm going to do is and stop on it. That time it was in tune. Let me do it again. I'll play it out of tune on purpose. Okay. If I didn't know that was flat, I would want to sit on that note out of tune and figure out what's wrong with it. So I know it's supposed to be a G. Hopefully I can hear the G in my head because the 2 notes right before it were Gs. But if I can't, then I should know, okay, it's a G. It's supposed to be really resonating. It's not, okay? I have an open G string next door. Ah, there we go. Okay, so I was flat. So then just like we were doing with the target practice, maybe I need to do some of that and figure out where that G is, right? Once I know where that G is, then putting it back in context and stopping on that G again, doing repetitions like we talked about with the target practice. Once I can get it in tune in that context, now I need to put it in a slightly larger context. So I'm going to go back. These are groups of 3 eighth notes. I'm going to go back a grouping. So Okay, that still feels good. Now I'm going to go back a grouping. Okay, that wasn't in tune. The things before the G and the G felt a little weird. So now I've discovered a weak place, right? I proved to myself that that was fine. I also proved that that was fine. Something about adding the grouping before messed it up. So now I need to go investigate what is going on there. Maybe I need to stop on another note. But that's how you want to practice intonation. Stop on the note in question, figure out what's wrong with it, then in a little context, do repetitions on it so that that note, you know exactly where it goes, and then you put it into slightly larger context until you either find, I get messed up when I'm, in my case, 2 groupings before, or maybe you could go all the way back, this was the beginning of the piece, all the way back to the beginning and it's fine, and now you've solved the problem. The next method for working on intonation that I'm going to share is called the spotlight method, or at least that's what I call it. I didn't make this up, I don't remember where I learned it, you may have another name for this, but basically what you're going to do for this method is you're going to pick one note in your passage that you've noticed is out of tune and it comes back a lot. So maybe there's a bunch of F sharps in your passage and you notice, oh man, I can't get those F sharps in tune. Every time you come to an F sharp, you're going to put a fermata on it so that you can really focus on those F sharps, but then every instance of the F sharp matches every other instance. So let me demonstrate what this will look like. So you can see I put a fermata on the F sharp. I held it out a little bit longer than it should be, and that really helped me listen to the F sharp, but make sure every F sharp that I played matched every other F sharp. The spotlight method is really good for bringing awareness to different notes and how they're out of tune. Once you've brought your awareness to the fact that, oh, my F sharps tend to be flat, let's say, then the method that we talked about a little bit ago, where you stop on the note in question and do repetitions on it, that would be the next step. So if you notice, especially if there's one particular F sharp that you're like, wow, that one was really, really out of tune, then like we talked about, you would want to isolate it and stop just on that F sharp, do repetitions on it like we discussed, until you can play it reliably in tune and then put it back into context. Another great method for working on intonation and bringing awareness to how the notes relate to each other is to give yourself a tonic, dominant, subdominant bath. My friend Sarah Nieblack, who does Spark practice, calls this the skeleton. I will put a link to her website here. She has outstanding resources about practicing, so I highly recommend checking those out. I love that she's called this the skeleton because it gives it a really cute name, helps you remember it. I first learned this method from Carol Rodland when I was in graduate school 100 years ago, and she had me do it with the fourth cello suite. I'm going to do it right now with the first Bach cello suite because most people know that. I think they'll recognize it. So first what you're going to do is you're going to play all versions of Do, of the tonic. In this case, this piece is in G major. So all the G's on your instrument with different fingerings all over. Play G's all over the place. Make sure all of your G's really match. Once you have all your G's matching, then you're going to add the dominant. So the fifth note of the scale, in this case D. So D's. And then D's and G's. This, D's and G's, until you've given yourself a nice tonic dominant bath. And now you're going to add in the subdominant, so the fourth note of the scale, in this case C. So C's all over your instrument, different fingerings. all of them together. So G's, D's, C's. You can hear all of these are nice and resonant on the viola because they're open string notes. So I'm really listening for the resonance. So now that I've given myself a bath in the tonic dominant, subdominant, now when I play, let's do the prelude of the first suite, I will have a much better sense of the key and where the notes fit in. It makes it more obvious when you're out of tune. You probably heard that one G that I was a little bit out of tune. When you've given yourself a bath like that, it's much more obvious when tonic dominant, subdominant are out of tune, but also the other notes in the key fall into place more easily. So this is a great way to just kind of improve your intonation in something tonal pretty quickly. If you notice, so for instance, I played that one G out of tune, that would be something then that I would isolate, like we've talked about, do repetitions on it, teach my finger, okay, where does that G go so that I can play it in tune reliably. The last idea I want to give you to help you improve your intonation and become more aware of intonation in context is using solfege if you've been trained in solfege, so do, re, mi, fa, so, etc. Particularly if you're an American and you've been trained in movable do, where do is always the tonic. That gives you an embedded sense of how each note functions, right? T to do has a very specific feel to it. And if you have, let's say, a C sharp going to D in the key of D major, T to do, if you know that that C sharp is T, it gives you a lot more context for that C sharp that helps you then find it on your instrument. I've talked before about how brains really like context. Brains don't like disembodied information that just seems random. And when you use the sort of embedded functions that you've come to know on a really deep level when you learn solfege, if you use that information, it gives your brain much more context in which to place the notes. I find thinking in solfege especially helpful for passages that are in really gross keys and or that are very physically awkward. I definitely don't think in solfege all the time. My solfege is not that great and that fast, but I do find it really helpful, sometimes even for something as small as like 3 notes, to just think, oh, that sounds like so fa mi, or that is so fa mi. And so I'll write it in my music, either for just a few notes, like I said, or sometimes for the whole phrase if I find it helpful, so that I don't have to like remember the solfege in the moment, that it's in there in the music and I can just read it. I also find it helpful in non-tonal context, believe it or not, for notes that sound like something tonal. So for instance, if you have 2 notes that sound like T do, that's a really strong association that most of us have if you know solfege. And even if it isn't actually T do because you're not in a key, if it sounds to you like T do, it can be really helpful to think that solfege, or so do, or mi re do, or something like that. That can really help give your ear and your brain a context in the non-tonal context that makes sense to you. Similarly, sometimes particular notes sound like, let's say, T again, but they don't actually go to do, T and then nothing else. You can imagine that it's T, and you can imagine do, again, going back to our conversation about audiation, you can imagine do, you can imagine that note that's hard to play as T leading to do, and that will help you find that note more successfully. So even if you're not great at solfege, like me, I think you'll find it really helpful, so I encourage you to experiment with this and see if you find it useful. Okay, that's the end of this part. In the next part, I'm going to talk specifically about double stops, so playing 2 notes at the same time. This is a very, very string player specific thing, so obviously for wind and brass players, not relevant for you guys because you only play 1 note at a time, but it's a big topic for us as string players, so I wanted to make a whole video on it. So I'll see you in part 4 if you're a string player and you want to know about double stops.